This year, you pretty much have two keynote speakers. Our next speaker, Ryan, has headlined a lot of other events. He's been asked, this is his 10th year, he's been asked to come here and speak, and there's a reason for that. He is an expert in this industry, and what you'll appreciate more than anything when you listen to Ryan is he's been raised, his parents were school teachers. And so when he speaks on something, I'll tell you what, when you walk away, you definitely have learned something. And if you haven't heard him speak, it's a treat. And so what you got coming up with Ryan Sitton is you got someone who's a very successful entrepreneur with his company Pinnacle. He has served public office in statewide position, and I hope he continues to do so. There's one statewide position in particular I'd really like to see him run for. He has been an author. He is an expert in risk and data. He's an engineer from Texas A&M. And his wife Jennifer and he have 3 kids. One I know is at Texas A&M, the other is at Texas A&M Corpus. But if you don't mind, please help me welcome our first of 2 keynote speakers today, Mr. Ryan Sitton.
This year I'm going to do something new because Chad asked me to do something specific. He asked if I would give some very specific economic data to talk about what's going to happen to the port over the next few years. Specifically, what will recession, interest rates, compression on commodities, what does this mean for the Port of Houston? Because of that, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to use slides. I know, daring. Let's see if this is going to work. Slide, guys. Yay. Today we're going to talk about, I say up here, energy, commodities, and the port. And why I'm going to talk about these in this order is normally, if you've been here before, you've heard me talk about energy a lot. And energy is a very interesting commodity to the Houston area and specifically to the port, but today I'm going to use it as a proxy. If you've watched the news, and one of the last speakers was joking about the fact that we are hearing that the election is coming 60 days out, and there's a lot of talk about the economy. Is the economy good or is the economy bad? Is inflation really bad or is it kind of bad? We know the price of goods at the house are bad, but how bad? And what does this mean to the election cycle and to people who are trying to make decisions about their life every day? But before I jump into this, I want to talk about Pinnacle. Normally I don't do this, but today it's important to give a frame of reference for why I know what I'm about to talk about. Pinnacle has been in business about 18 years, and Pinnacle specializes in reliability systems, reliability models for complex facilities. So we go into things like chemical plants, refineries, midstream operations, offshore oil platforms, lumber mills, water plants, anywhere where you have a bunch of different things that all have to work together to produce a product. We build the most advanced models the world has ever seen. And we can use those models to predict what's going to happen when things get thin, or things begin to break, or a product market switches, or we haven't looked inside it for a while, or we change our input blends. We can model those things. And those same models also apply when you look at things like the economy and things like the port. And so I want to thank the folks from Pinnacle where we have built these kind of models. I'm going to use some input today, but I'll use that input in a way that all of us will understand from our home. So back to energy, the economy, and the ship channel. First of all, let's talk about energy. The graph behind me right now is the global consumption of energy for the last 150, 200 years. And what you'll see as you look at this graph is that the world has used more energy every year except for 4. Every year for the last 200 years, the world has used more energy than the year before, except for 4 of those years. And those 4 years were 1, working backward, COVID, 2020. 2, working backward, the housing crisis of 2008, 2009. And 3, going all the way back to the late 1970s with the Middle East oil embargo. Those 3 times caused enough economic slowdown that the world actually consumed less energy. But if you look at the top of our graph, the far up right, you'll notice that, man, our energy consumption continues to grow. You'll notice that the number that the unit of measure here is 180,000 terawatts of energy every year. What is 180,000 terawatts? That's 180 million billion watts. And most of us are out there, and that kind of sounds like the national debt, right? Like, I don't know how many dollars 27 trillion is, but it's massive. Let's put this into context for today. If you live in a 2,000 square foot home or bigger, you probably have a 5-ton air conditioner. 180 million billion watt hours is 4 billion 5-ton air conditioners running 24/7 around the world every day. 4 billion 5-ton air conditioners. To think of it this way, that's one air conditioner, one 5-ton air conditioner, which can easily cool a 2,000 square foot home for every 2 people on the planet. Now, how much energy does the U.S. use? The U.S. uses about 27,500 terawatt hours, or roughly 15% of the world's energy. And if you convert this in terms of these 5,000 or these 5-ton air conditioning units, that's about 2 5-ton air conditioning units for every person in the United States. So Ryan, did I get this straight? You just said around the world, we average 1 air conditioning unit for every 2 people. In the United States, we average 2 air conditioning units for every 1 person. Yes, the United States uses 4 times as much energy per capita as the rest of the world combined. Now, someone's going to go, well, that's just not fair. But let's talk about where this energy comes from. Before I do, though, I want to hit on a quick topic about renewables. You'll notice when we talk about renewables, because a lot of people hear about renewables, I thought Pablo Vega was awesome, Vegas, and he talked about that there are days where actually Texas gets the biggest chunk of its electricity from renewables. However, electricity is not the only place we get and consume energy. This graph of U.S. energy consumption by source shows you that electricity is only a fraction of our energy consumption, and renewables are only a fraction of electricity. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to it. Let's talk about where energy comes from. This graph is a graph of where energy comes from around the world by region. If you look again at the far right bar, the one I wanted to draw your attention to is the second light blue bar, the third one from the top. That's North America. North America, and if I were to pull out the U.S. produces about 16% of the world's energy. We consume about 15% of the world's energy. We produce about 16% of the world's energy. So now you might think, oh, well, you eat what you kill. Let's go back to this idea of renewables, though, because yes, renewables are becoming a bigger and bigger part of our energy consumption. But get this. If you look at the world today and you ask how much energy is coming from renewables, and I mean wind and solar specifically, the ones that are in I'm not counting like dung or wood, which are renewable. I'm talking, the wind and solar. How much energy, what percentage of the world's energy comes from that? That is about 30% of the world's electricity. Electricity makes up 14% of the world's energy, so if you're doing the math, renewable energy today makes up about 4% of the world's total energy consumption. Why does that matter? Because when we're about to talk about oil as a proxy for commodities, it's important to go back, refresh your mind back to the graph I showed first, that oil is still the single biggest source for energy on the planet, and we can't live without it. So let's talk about what that means to us. This is the price of oil over the last 100 years. And you'll notice that, this is adjusted for inflation. You'll notice that for the first, 100 or 50 or 30 of those years, oil was fairly cheap. As it became a mainstay in our energy sources, it got higher. It fluctuated a lot. Let's look at just the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, oil has been relatively steady relative to past oil margins or oil prices, except for the year of COVID, where we obviously saw some really dramatic price fluctuations. You'll see that's been relatively steady. And in fact, up until the last few days, even as other commodity prices has begun to drop, the price of oil has stayed relatively steady in the low 80s and mid and high 70s. Like I said, dropping to, I think, high 60s today, as a matter of fact. So even as we look around the market and we say, as there is instability, inflation, all those sort of things, oil has been a relatively steady commodity price for the world, meaning energy has been a relatively stable energy market. does this mean? Even though we have seen a lot of inflation, and even though we've seen a lot of market fluctuations, they're talking about a downturn in demand, all those sort of things, we do know that base prices for things have gone up. In other words, the price to produce a barrel of oil is a lot higher today than it was 5 years ago. Labor, other electricity cost, parts, materials, steel, all of the costs to produce a barrel of oil have gone up, which means the price for us to consume that raw product of oil have gone up. So even as we get into a market in which we're beginning to see some declines, we're beginning to see that, some commodities are not declining like others. I want to use another one, case in point. This is the price of beef. If you look at the price of beef in 2019, the average price per pound of ground beef was $3.70 a pound. Do you know today, if you go to H-E-B, you're paying on average $5.50 per pound for ground beef. That is a 50% growth in the cost of a pound of ground beef. Now, wait a minute. Why? Where did the 50% increase come from? And while we're watching other things, for those of you who are in the operating sectors, refining margins, which we're going to talk about in a bit, chemical prices, other things are coming down. Why is beef still growing? I'm going to drop one thing now. I'm going to come back to it later. The number of cows in the United States is the lowest per capita it has been in 100 years. Hold that thought. What does this mean? Ryan's talking about oil. He's talking about beef. What I would say are raw products, the base things we use every day, not the hamburger in the store, but the cow in the field, not the gasoline in the tank, but the crude oil out of the well. The raw product costs are sustaining and even growing. And as we look at what might happen in a slowing economy, the ability for us to get those products and use them for things is going to continue to be challenged. What about other commodities? I mentioned some of them right now. Let's talk about things like gasoline. Remember when I talked about oil, I showed this graph, the last 10 years of oil, and note that over the last, roughly 2 years, the price of oil has been relatively stable. What about the price of gasoline? By comparison, the price of gasoline, while it looks the same, I want you to focus on this last piece, just the last couple of years, when you'll notice that the price of gasoline went from around $2.60, $2.70 a gallon, to $2 a gallon. Now, wait a minute. I noticed the price of oil is going down a little bit. How do those compare? Well, I'll put them together on a graph for you. Here's the price of oil and the price of gasoline, and most people sitting at home would say those look about the same. I can't see the difference in those, Ryan. Well, I'll do one more graph for you in which we separate these out and we talk about refining margins. Here are refining margins over the last 3 years. If you work in a refinery, you know somebody who works in a refinery, from roughly 2022 to end of 2023, that 2-year period was a really nice time in refining. Refineries were averaging somewhere in the range of $35 a barrel in refined margin. If you ask those same refiners today, hey, are you still doing well financially? They go, it's rough. Right now, refineries are somewhere in the $11 per barrel range in terms of margin. So what we're saying here is while the price of oil just recently came down a little bit, while the price of oil may have dropped 10%, the price of gasoline dropped 25%, that change in difference has meant refineries went from being very profitable for a 2-year stint to today being very, very lean. So your Valeros, your Marathons, your independent refiners, even the refineries that are owned by major independents, the Exxons, everyone will talk about refineries. It's a tough business today. And that's not the only place that this business is tough. What this means is anywhere, if I'm to draw a conclusion, anywhere in which I'm talking about the end product and not the raw product, there is some squeezing in between those with what I'll say excess capacity. Awesome. Did my slideshow turn off? Epic. Good. It came back on. I'm going to use 2 other examples where the market was predicting great demand, and yet things have softened, specifically electric vehicles and lumber. In 2021, Ford announced that by 2030, all of their SUVs were going to be electric. You with me? 2 weeks ago, Ford shrinks its electric vehicle rollout plans and has a $2 billion write-down. Ford said, hey, the demand isn't there. that the incremental cost for an electric vehicle that we thought all the consumers were going to pay, turns out they won't. And so we are scrapping our plans for EVs and instead going to hybrids. I'll give you one that's more extreme. During COVID, 2020, we're all starting to believe, oh man, right, we're all going to work from home the rest of our lives, right? The offices are a thing of the past. And a lot of us were sitting at home going, this dining room sucks as an office. And so everybody said, I got to remodel the house. Yeah? Right? I got to enclose my porch. I got to knock out a window. I got to tear down these cabinets. I definitely got to have somewhere for the wife to work so I can work. And so we did a bunch of remodeling projects. What happened to the price of lumber? The price of lumber peaked at $1,600 per 1,000 board feet in 2021. That was at the time, adjusted for inflation, 4 times the highest price it had ever been. 4 times the highest price. In the United States today, there are 800 sawmills. A sawmill brings a log in the front and sends boards out the back. You ask the sawmill in 2021 and 2022, hey, how's life? They're like, man, the boards are worth more than the dollars we could turn them into. Ask that same sawmill today, how's life? Over the last roughly 6 months of those 800 sawmills, something like 50 of them have been shut down. We're seeing the most extreme volatility in that industry that it has ever seen. And what's happened is the log prices are not going down. They've dropped by 10, 20%, maybe. But the boards on the back end are worth less than a fourth of what they were worth in 2021. So another example of the raw product is going down a little bit. The end product is going down a lot. And this is putting a squeeze on us. What does this mean? It means while raw products remain high, that the end products, which are what we kind of use every day, are getting squeezed more and more, and the people in the middle are feeling that squeeze. And that is particularly relevant to our conversation about the port. Before we get into that, though, we want to understand, why is all of this happening? Because if you've been to these conferences in the past, you've heard me talk about the fact that an economic slowdown is coming. I've been up here 2 years saying, hey man, recession's right around the corner. And some people are going, man, Ryan, you've said that for 2 years and it didn't hit yet, brother. I'm kind of doubting your abilities. Let me talk about this for a second. What caused this spike and this decline? First, let's talk U.S. economic numbers. So we're talking macroeconomy. In 2019, the U.S. economy was $28.38 trillion. 4 years later, the economy is $27.38 million, or a $6 trillion gain, a 28% growth. That's a ton. Now, if you talk to economists will tell you, yeah, Ryan, but that's got inflation. What we really do when we look at these kind of economic numbers is we break out what we think is expansion versus what we think is inflation. And when they talk about the expansion numbers, they talk real GDP, which is economic production where they take inflation out. Here is the real GDP numbers. In 2019, the real GDP, as they call it, $20.9 trillion. In 2023, $22.6 trillion, or 8% growth. So one would think that the other 20% would be inflation, right? Let's do some quick math. Here is the inflation numbers for the last 5 years up into 2023, from 1.81% in 2019 all the way through 8% in 2022. And that cumulative number down there at the bottom is from middle of 2019 to middle of 2023. So trying to get the average over that span, and that gets us about a 17% growth if you believe all these inflation numbers. The point is, I got 17% inflation growth. I got some 8% productivity growth, if we believe that, which means that, okay, there's still a 3% unaccounted for, and I will tell you, we are not producing more logs, we are not producing more beef, and our oil production, while our demand has grown by 2.5%, our oil production has grown by 1%. Our raw commodities are not producing 8% more than they were. The raw product is producing 1, maybe 2 when you look across a base load of commodities. What this means is that these prices will sustain. We have not matched our productivity to the output. When you ask that farmer about those cows, Mr. Rancher, why are there less cows per capita in the United States today than ever in history, or certainly since like the Great Depression? And the guy says, it's cost. I can't get people to come work the farm. I can't get water. I can't get plastics. I can't get the machinery to come out and get the hay fields done so I have something to feed the cows. The price is what's driven this up, and they can't produce, they cannot manage the cows to produce the beef. What caused all this then? During COVID, you can read the numbers up here. The federal government spent a lot of money, not just federal government, state governments. This is a quick breakdown between $1 trillion just reacting to COVID. This is just paying for things like breathing systems and drug trials. There were what I'm going to call up here disbursements of around $3.5 trillion. This was stimulus checks that were just sent directly to households. It was guaranteed loans to businesses. There was another indirect spend of $1 to $2 trillion in things like stimulus packages, money into certain industries. All total, the federal government, in about an 18-month period, spent between $6 and $7 trillion that was outside our normal economy. Does it shock us that our economy today is $6 trillion bigger when the government just spit $6 trillion into it? I don't think it should. Now, once again, if you've been listening to my talks over the last couple of years, you've heard me say, well, man, recession's here. I think we're about to hit it. And of course, the last couple of years have been pretty good. Ryan, why has there been a delay? If you believe it's happening today, and we are seeing it, we're seeing refining prices, chemicals prices, we're seeing a lot of the stuff around the Houston Ship Channel hitting difficult markets today. Why? This is the U.S. household savings levels for the last 10 years. You'll notice that at the time of COVID, U.S. savings levels hit $4 trillion. This is saying that the total amount of savings in household accounts, just household savings, was $4 trillion, by far the largest amount ever in history. Never had that much savings in the United States. So as the government was sending out all this money, and people were sitting at home not traveling, they were spending less, getting money, man, that money was building up. Fast forward to today, it's about $500 billion. So it's dropped from $4 trillion all the way down to $500 billion. That $500 billion is the lowest since the housing crisis of 2008 and 2009. And that housing crisis included discounts on savings for home bankruptcies. So in other words, we actually have less cash in our savings accounts today than we had then. We just didn't have this artificial detractor like we did in the housing market. Why do I think recession is finally hitting us today? People have spent all the money they've got. And now we're sitting here saying, I just can't afford to buy that $5.50 beef anymore. So what does this mean for us? If you're working in and around the port today, you're working at a chemical plant, at a transportation facility, you're working at a refinery, a lot of the port is in that middle group. We don't produce the raw commodities. We take in the raw commodities. We turn them, ship them, handle them, give them out to be consumed by Americans. We are in the area that we can probably say is going to feel the pressure, and some of us are already feeling it. I think it's because the economy has been faked. For the last couple of years, we've had prop-ups of all of these savings being spent and people spending down their savings, and now we're getting to the point that, man, the sort of reality is coming home to roost, and it's going to be tight the next couple of years. If you go with my numbers here and you believe them, we're probably overstating the economy by about 5%. If we see a 2.5% economic growth, real economic growth, that means it's going to take us 2 years to get out of this. Interest rate changes are adding further challenges. Because even if you said, yeah, man, I'm operating fairly profitably. I mean, it's a little lean, but I can get there, but I could go borrow some money and build something or expand something or make my business better. Well, make sure you can pay 8%. Because that's the cost of borrowing money today. That's an additional challenge on top of it. Which means that if you are an industrial operator today, more than likely you are changing your strategy. You'll hear folks talking about, and I wasn't here for the morning presentations, man, we are leaning heavier into excellent operation, less into capital investments. We're leaning more into being lean and mean, less into having the big and the best. Now, there is some good news in this when you do talk about the Houston Ship Channel, although I know I'm probably the doom and gloom end of the day. While there are less opportunities in expansion, the opportunities in operational excellence are gigantic. What I mean by that is everybody out there right now is saying, how can I lower cost? How can I reduce disruptions to my operation? How can I increase productivity? And there's a lot of demand on that. As I said, I missed one of the panels, but I heard they talked a lot about artificial intelligence, data analytics. They talked about using systems to get operationally better, and people are willing to invest in that. The thing is that investment's got to return value today, or at least very, very quickly. If I spend $1 on making my site better, I got to feel that in the next 6 to 12 months. Which means I'm going to end with a Pinnacle anecdote. This is to give while I've been sort of doom and gloom, this is not intended to be the case. It's more preparatory. Let's face reality that this is the world we're living in today. What do we do with it? Pinnacle's been in business, this is why I gave the opening introduction, for 18 years. And during those 18 years, we've always done reliability. That's our one area of expertise. And even though margins are getting smaller and everyone's feeling the pain, next year is probably going to be Pinnacle's best year in 5 years. Why? We happen to be in a business that does this type of work. We happen to be in a business that helps sites get operationally excellent. We've developed cool tools to do that. So this is my advice to everybody out there, whether you are an operator or you're somebody who services other companies on the ship channel, look for these kind of opportunities. Help your customers or help inside your businesses get lean, mean, and efficient. That is the area that all of the ship channel is going to be focused, or at least the majority of it, for the next few years. I'm going to end with a parting thought. I know it's like, oh man, thanks Ryan, I'm really fired up about the rest of my year. One thing why this is good, when any business leader sits around with his or her leadership team, they talk about the realities that they're facing. I assume most of you are doing some version of that every day, and knowing the landscape is most important. Understanding that these are the challenges we're going to face really is not depressing. What it does is it says, now I know what to do within this space. One thing about the economics and free market is excellence almost always wins. Yes, there's a lot of things out there we can't control. We can't control beef. We can't control foreign markets. We can't control what other countries are doing to subsidize oil prices. There's a lot of things we can't control, but there's a lot of things when it comes to operational excellence that we do. So my message is this. Take in the fact that this is probably the new reality for the next couple of years, and recognize if I go become operationally excellent, exercise the discipline to do and run my business well, there is plenty of room to succeed. In fact, the recent run-up, the expansion in cost has made that opportunity even bigger. So while the landscape may look more challenging, I'll finish with the fact that opportunities, I think, are as big as ever. And I hope that you can find yours too. Thank you very much for letting me spend time with you today.